Among the many things for which the Queen will be remembered is her intense affection for Corgis, of which she possessed over 30 throughout her reign, 4 beloved friends, the last breath of a monarch, and a broken dynasty so destroyed that even the most defenseless creatures perished in their conflict. Muick, this is not the story that Buckingham Palace painstakingly prepared for the general public. This isn't the staged social media effort, the polished media statement, or the whitewashed tale designed to repair a fallen prince's damaged reputation. This is the true story of what happened to Queen Elizabeth's corgis. The dogs she covertly prepared for during her final months, the animals she loved more than some of her own children, and the animals that were eventually used as pawns in an unidentified royal marketing machine. You will understand why the palace remained completely silent when this revelation comes to a finish, why a perfectly robust young corgi perished under dubious circumstances, why the woman who claimed to care for them abruptly stopped posting updates to the public, and why the lone surviving dog ended itself somewhere completely different from its Muick's stated destination. Stay still, because this story turns out to be more outrageous and heartbreaking than any tabloid sensation you've ever come across. It is necessary to understand Muick, what these corgis actually meant to Queen Elizabeth II, in order to comprehend the value of these canines to the monarch. This went beyond a simple pastime or quirky royal quirk that produced eye-catching images. This was Muick, a 7-decade romance, maybe the strongest, most unwavering connection of her life. It all started when her parents gave her a Pembroke Welsh corgi named Susan on her 18th birthday in 1944. Everything was radically changed by that one animal. The Queen built an empire out of that one Muick gift. A corgi empire spanning generations, not just a royal one. She would own more than 30 corgis over the next 70 years. And Muick, here's the incredible, unbelievable detail. Almost all of them were descended from Susan, the first dog that was given to an 18-year-old Princess Muick, who had no idea that she would go on to become the longest-reigning sovereign in British history. She became the matriarch of a royal bloodline that spanned 3 generations of queens, outlasting prime ministers, presidents, and international conflicts. However, the essence is not captured by numbers. Few people outside the palace fully comprehended the close relationship that existed between Queen Elizabeth and her corgis. Instead of using footmen or the complex royal staff system to handle everything from her wardrobe to her letters, she served them herself from silver bowls in accordance with set procedures that had been evolved over decades. She was familiar with the tastes, disposition, and peculiarities of every dog. Muick, she took them on royal tour, included them in official photos, created a special corgi room at Buckingham Palace, and strolled them through the palace gardens. The corgis appeared to be true companions rather than accessories when photographer Annie Leibovitz visited the Queen in 2007. This is the most illuminating feature. The world saw a queen grieving alone after her 73-year spouse, Prince Philip, passed away in Muick, April 2021. Due to co-constraints, she was forced to sit alone at his funeral, wearing a mask, listening to music, and appearing as a diminutive figure in a massive chapel, which was one of the most tragic pictures of her reign. But what kept her going throughout those gloomy months after Philip passed away? Muick's several palace accounts claim that it was her pets. They accompanied her around the chambers of Windsor Castle, slept in her bedroom, and sat next to her at meals. This is how a former palace insider put it. The dogs resembled her kids. Compared to some of her real children, she was more concerned about them. Think about that for a moment. The woman who overcame decades of royal scandals, dysfunctional families, and worldwide crises found her greatest comfort in 4 small puppies that were unaware of her royal rank rather than Muick, in the crown or duty. This explains why Queen Elizabeth made very particular, discreet, personal preparations as her health declined in her last year. Knowing her kids, being familiar with the palace's workings, and not wanting to leave this to chance, she thought carefully about what would happen to each dog. Muick, this is where reality starts to drastically deviate from the palace's interpretation. On September 8, 2022, at the age of 96, Queen Elizabeth II passed away at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The world grieved. Her funeral was witnessed by billions. The monarchy entered a new era as world leaders came together. Buckingham Palace made a statement about the dogs a few days later. The 2 corgis, Muick and Sandy, would go to Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park with Prince Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson. A Cocker Spaniel would be placed discreetly with members of the royal household. At first, this seemed reasonable, even poignant. In fact, Andrew had given 2 of those corgis to the Queen. When Muick came in early 2021, the Queen needed consolation and Prince Philip was quite sick. Following Philip's passing in April 2021 was Sandy. A second tender gesture from a son to his mother, so didn't it seem reasonable the canines that Andrew donated would come back to him? Speaking about it in public, Sarah Ferguson seemed really moved. She stated in interviews that the corgis will stay with them and get loving care. She had been walking and caring for these 2 amiable corgis. She posted pictures of the corgis on Instagram showing them rolling in grass, roaming across the grounds of the Royal Lodge, and looking happy and healthy. She talked about how the Queen would have wanted them to be happy. Everything looked flawless. Muick, however, this is the first question that needs to be taken into account. Why Andrew? Prince Andrew was perhaps the most disgraced member of the British royal family when the Queen passed away. Both royal patronage and military titles had been taken away from him. Settled a legal action with Virginia Jai for an undisclosed amount that was reportedly in the millions, withdrew from royal responsibilities and was essentially banished from the family. Muick, invisible at public events but present at private ones. The new monarch, King Charles, had no desire to interact with him in public. Therefore, the Queen had the option to carry on her most cherished legacy among all others. Why this particular man? Why him instead of employees who had walked, fed and cared for these animals for decades? Why him instead of someone the Queen regularly trusted? As Muick will show us, the answer tells us everything about palace operations and how little it truly represented the Queen's true desires. You don't have many dogs anymore. Proceed. Everything appeared to be fine for a few months. Sarah shared pictures. Muick, Andrew was sometimes pictured at. The public and Royal Lodge mostly moved on to more significant stories, such as preparing for the coronation and creating a new monarchy. But then subtly something shifted. Early in 2023, royal watchers, those devoted fans who follow every social media post, every public appearance and every little aspect of royal life, noticed something strange. On Sarah Ferguson's Instagram, the corgis had disappeared, not gradually, not with updates or farewell posts, but total radio silence. Stopped photos, allusions, Muick. Stopped, complete lack of contact. So what? People don't post about their dogs every day, but this was Sarah Ferguson, who had very publicly positioned herself as the devoted caretaker of the Queen's beloved legacy, you could ask. She had embraced the corgis as part of her personal rebranding as a responsible, kind and loving Sarah who took care of her former mother-in-law's most treasured pets. Thus it was noteworthy when she abruptly stopped talking. This silence also corresponded with something else, the eviction battle. In one of his first significant acts as king, King Charles started to put pressure on Prince Andrew to leave Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion that he had essentially rented out for more than 20 years. The palace wanted it returned and offered Andrew smaller accommodations at Frogmore Cottage, which Harry and Meghan had briefly occupied. Imagine what life at Royal Lodge must have been like when Andrew refused, hired solicitors, and went to battle with his own brother. The house was contested, the future was uncertain, and somewhere in the middle of all of this were 2 corgis who had spent their entire lives in the serene, orderly, extremely routine setting of the Queen's household. Muick, legal battles, ongoing tension, Andrew under tremendous financial pressure without royal income, Sarah managing her own career while facing her own financial scandals and public controversies, her own ongoing battle for relevance. Soft carpets, silver bowls, Muick, dogs that knew nothing but Windsor Castle, and a kind old woman who planned her days around them. At the time, a royal insider told British tabloids that Andrew was hardly at home. The corgis weren't living the life they had known. Instead, they were living in a house at war, which was very different from the Instagram version of Sarah's frequent travels, and the fact that those unfortunate animals were being cared for by staff were accurate, as confirmed by numerous sources. Muick, then came news that stopped everyone cold. On that specific day that Muick we now understand is the date, Sarah Ferguson sent a brief statement on social media in October 2023. One of Queen Elizabeth's favourite corgis, Sandy, had passed away. "Goodbye, dear Sandy," she wrote. "You were a good boy and will be sorely missed." That was all. There were no specifics, no justification, no background, just a hurried, ambiguous farewell. Hold on, because this is the part of the story that has actually plagued Royal. Following ever since, Muick, let me explain why Sandy's passing caused such a stir. Corgis are sturdy, healthy dogs that often live 12 to 15 years. What happened? Sandy was around 5 years old when he passed away, which is the prime of a Corgi's life rather than old age. The palace said nothing, Andrew said nothing, and Sarah's statement was so succinct that it felt almost purposefully ambiguous, as if admitting the death just enough to avoid allegations of concealment but disclosing nothing at all about circumstances. Online dog enthusiasts and royal veterinary specialists were perplexed. What ailment kills a healthy 5-year-old corgi? These aren't intrusive queries, rather they are straightforward, sensible inquiries about the health of dogs that truly belong to the country. Were the corgis receiving sufficient care, frequent veterinary exams, proper diet and exercise? Was there an accident, disease, or environmental factor? There had been no public updates regarding Sandy's health, no mention of illness, and no sign that anything was amiss in the weeks and months leading up to his death, which makes the palace's silence all the more unsettling. The complete narrative of Sandy's death has never been revealed, according to serious royal critics rather than conspiracy Muick theorists. One day the corgis existed in a silent media blackout, and the next one was gone. Can you blame them for asking? Do you believe the palace has been truthful about what happened to Sandy? The palace has a history of controlling, repressing, and changing narratives to protect powerful people. Regardless of one's religious beliefs, the way royal institutions treat animal welfare frequently reveals a lot about how they treat human welfare as well. Therefore, it is in this life-giving light. Following Sandy's passing, all focus shifted to Muick, the last of Queen Elizabeth's cherished companions, still carrying the royal bloodline music of that first corgi, Susan, given to a young princess in 1944. The truth started to surface in early 2024. Muick was no longer residing at Royal Lodge with Andrew and Sarah. Reporters were informed by sources close to the royal family that Muick had been discreetly moved to Windsor Castle, where he was now primarily cared for by royal staff, the same staff who had known the Queen, her routines, and her dogs for years. A palace insider stated clearly that although Andrew and Sarah frequently visit the dog, Muick now resides at Windsor, where staff are familiar with the routine and understand the dog's needs. According to Palace, the prior arrangement wasn't working, the dog wasn't getting the care it needed, and something needed to change. In other words, it's better this way. When you look at the whole picture, it's easy to see why. Andrew had no formal income or royal position, was involved in a growing legal and financial dispute with his own brother, and his entire life had turned into a management issue for the palace, Charles, and evidently himself. In 2023, after receiving a devastating diagnosis of breast cancer earlier that year, Sarah Ferguson was dealing with serious illness, recovery, and ongoing pressure from her own complex public life. Meanwhile, he was fighting to stay in a house he didn't own, funded by a deceased mother, with no clear path forward. This is the detail that cuts Muick deepest. Neither person was in a position to give a dog, especially one that had recently lost its lifelong friend and primary human, the secure, loving, constant care that a dog sorely required. Like all the Queen's corgis, Muick had grown up in an exceptionally stable environment. Muick, the Queen's household, ran like clockwork, with regular feeding times, walking routes, familiar faces, and a peaceful, orderly setting every day. For these dogs, routine wasn't just comfort, it was the cornerstone of their entire world. The return to Windsor was the right decision, but should it have come to this point? Instead, they had chaos, a house and legal dispute, two primary carers who were rarely present, staff working hard without the authority or resources of the entire royal household, and trauma from losing companion Sandy under still unexplained circumstances. Who is accountable for the fact that it did? Two other dogs, Candy, the Queen's Dorgie, a Dachshund Corgi cross, led completely different lifestyles as the world concentrated on the drama between Muick, Sandy, and Andrew, showing something significant about what the Queen actually wanted. And Lissy, her Cocker Spaniel, were never assigned to Andrew. Instead, they were placed with staff from the start. Candy moved in with a senior member of the royal household who had worked closely with the Queen for decades. This person was familiar with her preferences, schedule, and affection for these animals. There were no press releases about these placements, no Instagram postings, no meticulously planned picture calls. Instead, Lissy went to a Queen's page that had spent years walking, feeding and taking care of the dogs as part of everyday chores. These were not publicity stunts but sincere acts of kindness. In 2024, Candy passed away at the astounding age of 18. The preparations were made quietly, confidentially, and without any hoopla, which, if you understand how things actually get completed in royal houses, usually implies something was done well. Lissy, who is still living as of 2026, has an amazing lifetime for her breed, which speaks to years of outstanding attentive care and music, exactly as the Queen would have offered, and exactly what a committed long-term staff member would know how to recreate. Compare those results to what happened with Sandy and Muick, one of whom died at the age of 5 under mysterious circumstances. By all accounts, she was happy and healthy, living with someone who truly loved her and understood from the beginning what caring for one of the Queen's dogs' music meant. There is no denying the pattern. The canines that prospered were those who went to staff, people the Queen personally interacted with who were familiar with her routines and shared her ideals. Another relocated because his placement failed. What does the fact that canines that visited Andrew had tragic and disruptive endings tell us about the Queen's true motivations? Music. This is the part of the story that the palace really doesn't want to talk about. According to several people close to the royal family, Queen Elizabeth expressed very specific wishes about her dogs in her last months, stating that she didn't want them to be used as royal mementos or as pawns in family politics. She named certain persons and wanted them to be with people who would truly love and care for them. According to a former palace employee, Her Majesty made it clear in her final months that she wanted dogs going to people who love them. Music, mentioning specific staff members by name. If this is accurate, which the evidence strongly suggests it is, the palace's decision to publicly announce the Corgis would go to Andrew was the palace's wish rather than the Queen's. Consider Andrew's life in September 2022. Music, stripped of HR title, paid millions to settle a lawsuit. This is a PR choice made by those handling the optics of a very tough issue. After being publicly humiliated throughout the world, King Charles, who was now in charge of the organization, needed to show that Andrew was still family and that, in spite of everything, the Queen still loved, trusted, and saw him as a member of the inner circle. Since the Queen's closest friends are the best representation of her trust, giving Andrew the Corgis sent a public message. It was potent royal communication, or would have been if Andrew had been able to take care of them, as the Queen trusted him, forgave him, and continued to see him as family. The tragedy is that, according to those same sources, the Queen, who knew her son better than anyone alive, likely anticipated precisely this, which is why she made backup plans. Music staff members were briefed, behind-the-scenes arrangements were made. The Queen realized that, despite what the palace said in public, real care for her dogs needed to be anchored in something more dependable than Andrew's. Excellent intentions, she was correct, and the music events that followed demonstrated it. There's another character in this tale that merits consideration. One whose participation has been virtually ignored is King Charles III. In the more than 2 years following his mother's passing, Charles has never, at least not in public, mentioned her dogs, visited them, or asked about them. To the best of anyone's knowledge, he has exhibited little interest in the animals who were his mother's most frequent companions. For others, this is just a matter of taste. Music. Charles is more known for his love of horses and gardens than dogs, which is understandable given that not everyone is an animal lover, but there is a more significant symbolic aspect to consider. Charles has based his rule on the idea of a slimmed-down monarchy with fewer working royals, lower expenses, and a modernized institution devoid of extravagance and spectacle from earlier times. None of that fits with the brand he's music building. Corg is galloping around Windsor Castle, staff are committed to their care, and there is a pedigree of royal canines that dates back to 1944. The Corgis stand in for Elizabeth. The old monarchy focused on continuity, tradition, and intensely personal relationships that characterized who she was. Charles may be unintentionally or intentionally making a line between her era and his own by separating himself from his mother's canines. It's arguable if that's the right institutional decision, but it's important to remember that the creatures your mother cherished beyond nearly anything music else in her last years deserve at least recognition. Charles's monarchy will be different, and the dogs serve as a reminder of everything it's giving up. Sandy the Corgi Andrew gave to the Queen following Prince Muick Philip's death in October 2023 at the age of about 5. Let's evaluate where each and every one of these dogs ended up, because the whole picture proves more revealing than any individual piece. This recognition has never materialized. Muick, no comprehensive statement was released, and the reason of death was never made public. Candy the Dory passed away in 2024 after receiving exceptional care from a senior member of the royal household. Her long and healthy life is evidence of the care she received. He is no longer with us, and the circumstances surrounding his death are still unknown. Muick, the last Corgi and the last direct link to the Queen's 70-year affection, and Lissy, the Cocker Spaniel, are both alive and well in 2026, living contentedly with a former royal page who has known her since puppyhood. Affair with her cherished dogs resides at Windsor Castle, not with Andrew or at Royal Lodge, but at Windsor, where the Queen reared generations of corgis, where the staff has no routines, where silver bowls, walking roots music, and the quiet order of a devoted household still exist in some form. Andrew and Sarah occasionally visit, but Muick now belongs to Windsor, belongs to people who love the Queen, and in ways that are both beautiful and heartbreaking. That's most fitting conclusion this story could be. Accomplish, the palace has said very little about all of this. Muick, there have been no updates, declarations, or admissions that the initial plan was a failure. Let's address the subject this video set out to investigate: what actually happened to Queen Elizabeth's corgis. It's just the typical institutional silence that shields the powerful while allowing everyone else to piece together the truth from bits. Muick, and what does it show? Andrew was a public relations weapon utilized by the palace. Giving him the corgis was never about the dogs, but more about controlling the public's perception of a disgraced Prince Muick during the most delicate time in the recent history of the royal family, the Queen having just passed away. Andrew was a liability, the monarchy was changing, and the corgis served as handy story devices by stating, he's still family. She still had feelings for him, it's all good, it wasn't all good. One 5-year-old dog died for no apparent reason, and another was discreetly moved since the arrangement the palace so widely praised didn't work. The Queen knew her dogs, knew her family, had 96 years of experience with both, and made her wishes known. These wishes, according to numerous reliable sources, did not include entrusting her most beloved companions to a son who was fighting eviction, managing collapsing reputations, and hardly present at home. However, the hardest truth is that the dogs who were placed quietly with devoted staff members are the Muick, ones who lived long, healthy, and happy lives. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth put her dogs first, created routines around them, created spaces for them, and made final arrangements because she loved and understood them. The dogs were completely dependent on the surrounding humans to do right, and those humans, aside from staff who eventually intervened, prioritized optics over welfare. They were unable to speak up for themselves, tell anyone what they needed, protest arrangements, or request relocation. The heartbreaking truth of this story is not only what happened to the dogs, but also what it reveals about how power functions, how institutions defend themselves, how narratives are constructed, and how the most vulnerable family members, human or animal, pay the price when those in charge prioritize their own. The institution she dedicated her entire life to responded by using those same dogs to rehabilitate the image of the family member she arguably had the most complicated relationship with. Interests: Sandy deserved better than a hazy 2-sentence farewell without explanation. Queen Elizabeth II deserved better than having her final wishes altered for a press release. And her corgis deserved better than being entangled in family power struggles and eviction disputes. Do you think Sandy's death has ever been adequately explained? Do you think the palace should have been more open about what happened to these dogs? Do you think Andrew should have gotten them in the first place? This type of story is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic royal headlines, divorces, Muick, titles, and feuds, but occasionally quieter tales, like the one about 4 tiny dogs and the woman who loves them above all else, reveal the most about people's true selves. If this video gave you something to think about, revealed something you didn't know, or confirmed your suspicions, please share, like, and subscribe for more stories about what really goes on behind palace doors, not the version they want you to see. Her corgis are dispersed and the Queen has vanished.